We have already talked about a few important things, so I'm not going to repeat those things. But I am giving you a minute to maybe just talk about all those points. We defined what is hermeneutics, and before that, we first of all we talked about the concept phenomenology. There, we had occasion to discuss the ideas of Husserl, that is German philosopher. Later, we saw that how one of his most celebrated disciples, Martin Heidegger, differed from him, and Heidegger advanced his own ideas. After discussing Heidegger's ideas, we had a look at two important names. One was American hermeneutist, that is E.D. Hirsch, and the other was another important name, Gadamer, who was a German philosopher, right? So German philosopher Gadamer and American hermeneutist E.D. Hirsch, we discussed their ideas. And you know that Hirsch was important because he was talking directly about literature and literary meaning. So many of those important questions like what is the meaning of a work, how do we interpret, how do we interpret a work, whether the meaning of a work is stable for all times or whether the meaning changes, who are the people who receive a particular work, all these questions were discussed. And then we took these questions again when we defined the concept of hermeneutics. What exactly is hermeneutics? Because many words have come up again and again in this entire discussion. One is hermeneutics and one is phenomenology. So hermeneutics we define, and you know that many of these important names that we encountered in this discussion, they were using hermeneutics. Now, one very important offshoot of that development was one particular theory which developed in Germany. That theory has a name. It is called reception theory. Reception theory. We were just in the midst of some discussion about reception theory, but otherwise we have covered a lot of ground. And reception theory is the subject that I am discussing today. So I'm going to unmute you for a while so that for about 2 minutes you can possibly say something. And you know that when I unmute you, it becomes a bit chaotic also. So it is just for 2 minutes, but maybe we can hear something from you. So Afrin is here, and you just raise your hands, and others will know that you are saying something. So who will say something first? Just raise your hand. Yeah, Afrin is going to say something. Okay, so let Afrin be unmuted. Not all, but Afrin be. We'll just unmute Afrin for a while. This is Afrin. Yes, this is Afrin. Yeah. Just a minute. Yes. Yes, Afrin.
Sir, in the last discussion, in the last class, we have discussed phenomenology, and we have discussed somewhat about hermeneutics, and then we discussed about then we discussed something about German reception theory, and uh, uh, um, we discussed some bit about University of Constance, and
Exactly, exactly. University of Constance.
and yes, sir.
Yeah, please go on, go on. Please continue, Afrin.
Sir, we discussed that in German reception theory, human significance is very much important, and uh, uh, the we discussed something about historical positivist theory, historical positivist paradigms.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, sir.
Somebody just speak about hermeneutics. Maybe say something about hermeneutics. What exactly is hermeneutics, and how did we discuss hermeneutics? Yes.
Um,
So raise your hand.
Sir,
Raise your hand if you want to talk about hermeneutics for about maybe just 2 minutes? Who? Anyone? It is the study of understanding. It is a study of interpretation, meaning, those things, right? And you know that it takes its name from Greek mythology, from one important god. He was Greek god Hermes. And what was the job that Greek god Hermes used to do, or what is he known as? Basically, he was the deliverer and interpreter of messages. So that means when you think about a message and this message is a kind of text, so we talk in terms of, say, interpreting that message. So hermeneutics is basically a study of understanding. It is basically a study of interpretation. So we know that it also has a particular history of the interpretation of biblical texts. So basically it was applied to a study of the Bible, and of course many of those biblical stories. And you know that scriptures need to be interpreted. Scriptures need to be interpreted at a later time also. So hermeneutics essentially was concerned with the study of scripture, basically meaning and interpretation and understanding of scriptures. But gradually its scope widened, and you know that hermeneutics was also used to study different kinds of texts, not necessarily biblical texts. And that text can be written, that text can be performed, and that text can be photographic. So the images that you see, they come in the category of photography. The performance that you see, whether it is a performance on the stage or a performance on the screen, so that is also an aspect of text. And of course all those stories, poems, novels, that means written text. So hermeneutics can be used to understand basically all three kinds of text. One very important name in hermeneutics is Frederick Schleiermacher. Frederick Schleiermacher. So you can possibly Google this name also. One very important thing about hermeneutics is that it is a study of a dialogue between past and present. It establishes a dialogue between past and present, a point that we have discussed. And it tries to remove all obstacles which can hinder interpretation. So we study a text and there are some obstacles in the interpretation of that text. Hermeneutics tries to remove all those obstacles. There is another term which is related to hermeneutics, that is hermeneutical circle. It means that there are threads in a work and there is a particular context. So different threads of a work or different say aspects of a work or different features of a work can be interpreted, or they are intelligible only with reference to the context, and context is intelligible with reference to all those features of a work, and that completes a kind of hermeneutical circle. So hermeneutical circle, if you see, context and different features together with the context complete the hermeneutical circle, and context together with all those different features complete hermeneutical circle. You see that there is one charge against hermeneutics, that it was really used to study not only scriptures but also important canonical works, important works in the history of literature. That means works basically written in the past. How will hermeneutics apply to current works? That is again a question open to debate. So just this bit of revision about hermeneutics. And of course, we have seen that Gadamer, we have already come across that how some ideas that you encountered while discussing hermeneutics, they are relevant to our study of Gadamer's ideas also. So finally, when we see this whole field of study, which goes by the name of reception aesthetics or reception theory, reception aesthetics and reception theory, you can show them this. Yeah, children, just 1 minute's digression. Sami ma'am is showing you something, and
Oyster mushrooms.
this is oyster mushroom. Just see, this is something
Exotic.
which is very exotic, and this is something which was grown at home.
This is slant curry, slant.
Okay, you can show it yourself, and you can talk about this.
अरे ठीक है.
Come. Just 1 minute. Just 1 minute. Yeah. It won't
Oh,
hurt them.
break.
It won't hurt them. It won't hurt them.
Hello, good morning, all of you. Hello.
Just show it.
Can you see this?
Oyster mushroom.
These are oyster mushrooms,
Yes, ma'am.
and they are exotic and not available in Aligarh. Very rich in B vitamins. So super healthy food. Anti-infection, antiviral, and they're growing them at home. They grow in grass, and you know, what should I say? Wood shavings. They don't grow in soil. So this is fungus. This is not fruit or vegetable, and they're extremely beautiful. You know, like shaped like oyster shells. These are oyster mushrooms.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for this little digression. Yeah.
Thank you.
Some light movements won't hurt. Yeah. So we come back to reception theory. Okay, reception theory. And you know that which is the name which is associated with reception theory? One very important name. And this important name is the name of Robert Joss. That is Hans Robert Joss. H-A-N-S, Robert, and J-A-U-S-S. Who was Robert Joss? Again, a very important German theorist. Afrin mentioned that University of Constance is a very important center of reception studies. Now, there are some powerful influences on reception studies. That means if we study reception of works and if we study reception theory as a whole field of literary studies, we can also note some points of comparison between reception theory and some other theories with which you are familiar. You can say that there are some important precursors of reception theory. You can also say that there are some powerful influences on reception theory. So we identify 5 important influences on reception theory. 5 important influences on reception theory. And of course, this is the research of one very important writer. And this book is titled Reception Theory. It was published under one particular series, that is New Accent series, brought out by Routledge. So what are those 5 major influences on reception theory? One major influence is Russian formalism. Russian formalism, you have already come across this term and you are also studying Russian formalism. So very quickly, Russian formalism, as the name implies, talked about form of literature. But it talked about form as a matter of using some devices by writers. So for Russian formalism, art was understood in relation to the devices which writers use, because they were basically concerned with one very important question, and that question was, what is literary and what is literariness? And the search for literariness took them to study art and the devices which are used in a work of art. So art becomes a kind of device This was an important idea in Russian formalism. Another important idea in Russian formalism was that art makes things strange. It defamiliarizes our reality. So this concept of defamiliarization, that means something with which we are familiar, but we usually do not pause and see the nature of this reality. We simply recognize things which are around us. We don't see them. Recognizing something is a very passive kind of activity, but seeing something is a more active kind of activity. So if a writer writes about a tree, or if he writes a story about a leaf on a tree, we see those leaves every day, but we simply recognize those leaves. But the writer makes us see those leaves because he defamiliarizes the familiar. That is an important aspect of Russian formalism. Another important of Russian formalism was that it was also interested in the question of literary history. In literary history, there are some forms of literature which are considered important. Later, those forms become unimportant, and then new forms come up for discussion. So, a minor form which could have been popular maybe 200 years ago, that form is neglected, is not discussed, but maybe 200 years later, that form becomes important. So this entire development of literary history was also something which interested Russian formalists. So when we say that Russian formalism was one major influence on reception theory, we are saying that this conception of art as devices, this whole idea of defamiliarization, and this interest in literary history, all three important concepts had their influence on reception theory, right? There is another very powerful influence on reception theory, and this is one German philosopher whose name was Roman Ingarden, Roman, Roman, and Ingarden, Ingarden, Roman Ingarden. Roman Ingarden talked about text, and he talked about the fact that text do not always come ready-made with their meaning, but rather text have some gaps or some points of indeterminacy. This is an important word. Texts have some points of indeterminacy. When we say indeterminacy, let us try to know what we mean by indeterminacy. You have the word determine. You determine something. You determine the meaning of something. And its opposite can be, say, something which cannot be determined. Indeterminacy means those points which are a bit vague, where something is left out, where something is not said, and where the reader is expected to fill up the gap. So all texts have those points of indeterminacy. That is the idea of Roman Ingarden. There is another interesting word that Roman Ingarden uses. A text is basically a kind of schemata. Schemata means a kind of, say, skeleton structure. It gives you kind of framework, and then that framework is filled up by the imagination of the reader. So these two important things, indeterminacy, all texts, especially those literary texts, they come not ready-made with meaning, but rather they have points of indeterminacy. They are a kind of schemata which are, and there is interesting word, given a kind of concrete form by the reader. So texts achieve concretion. some kind of solidity. A schemata, a skeleton structure achieves some solidity by the act of reading on the part of a reader. So this is another important concept, and we'll come back to this when we take up Jaws. And then there was another powerful influence, and that was Prague structuralism. And you know that Prague structuralism developed, or it had a very large canvas. Structuralism developed in Russia, structuralism developed in Prague, and structuralism also developed in France. So Prague structuralism is also an important influence, especially the work of John Mukrovsky and Felix Bedica. Then there is another name we have already discussed his work, Hans Georg Gadamer, and that is why we are discussing hermeneutics. His view of hermeneutics, which we have discussed, especially that dialogue between past and present, which was an important idea in his work. And he also had a very positive view of prejudice. When you read a work, you have some prejudices, you have some pre-understandings, you have some pre-ideas with which you begin that work. Now this prejudice is not a bad thing in Gadamer, but rather it's a positive thing. It's a creative prejudice. And why? Because this prejudice has come from literary history, from a long history of reading. It is part of a whole tradition of reading, a part of a whole literary tradition. So if you start reading a work and you have a certain prejudice which you bring to that work, but that prejudice is not a negative thing, but rather it has come from literary history, it has come from tradition, it has come from long association with works. So Gadamer is important for these ideas. First, his views on hermeneutics, especially this relationship between past and present whenever we talk about works of literature, and also his positive view about prejudice. So Russian formalism, Roman garden, Prague structuralism, and ideas of Gadamer. And which is the fifth very important influence? That fifth important influence is sociology of literature. Sociology of literature. When I say sociology, don't think that my sheen kaf is not drust. The correct pronunciation is not sociology, but rather it is sociology, right? So what is important here is sociology of literature. Means literature exists in a particular time period, and there is also a history of taste. History of taste. What people liked at a particular point of time, what were their taste about things, how their taste changed, and similarly how something is received, how something was received earlier, how something was appreciated and not appreciated, and also this question of historiography. Historiography is different from history, that is method of studying history. Theory of, say, history writing, historiography. Just to make it more clear, you say that Marxist historiography is different from postmodern historiography. In Marxist historiography, what is important? Economic factor, class struggle, how different classes struggled for power, how economic considerations played a very important role in the development of different institutions. That is Marxist historiography. On the other hand, you also have terms like nationalist historiography, especially with reference to history of India. Nationalist historiography In other words, actually it means that history written from a particular point of view. And then British historiography was another term where British historians try to interpret Indian history in a particular manner. So historiography, basically ideas about writing history. Now sociology of taste and reception of works and writing of history, these are all important questions in sociology of literature. So sociology of literature also became a very important influence on reception studies or reception theory. Now we can possibly talk about reception theory in greater details, and we can possibly see reception theory in a more clear light. So Robert Joss, he used one concept. That concept comes from one important scientist, T.S. Kuhn. What is that concept? The concept of paradigm. The concept of paradigm. And there is another term which he uses. That term is horizon of expectations. Horizon of expectations. Right. So what is important for Joss is literary history. He is greatly interested in history, and he is greatly interested in literary history. So you know that if Joss is interested in history, if he is interested in literary history, where is this influence coming from? Obviously, it is coming from sociology of literature. It is coming from, say, also Gadamer. But he is also interested in formalism. He's also interested in formalism. That means study of forms of literature, because literature, he was unhappy with the development of literary history in his time. Often literary history was written in a particular manner. And what was that manner? Some important political and economic events, some important events which were important from the point of view of politics, from the point of view of economics, they were described. And then the work of a writer was described. The idea was that there is a relationship of cause and effect between those developments in the field of economics, in the field of politics, and works of literature. That means there is a direct cause and effect relationship. So for example, if a particular work is written today, there is one particular cause. You discussed, okay, say the scare of COVID virus, the scare of, say, coronavirus. And if a particular work is showing some kind of anxiety, you say that, okay, because there was anxiety about this whole thing, and so the writer's work also shows that element of anxiety, this cause and effect relationship. And similarly, if industrial revolution happened, then these works show the influence of industrial revolution. So usually literary history was also written in this manner, where a cause and effect relationship was seen between developments in the outside world and works of literature. Joss was not too convinced with this cause and effect relationship, right? So this is an important thing. But he was interested in formalism, and he was interested in Marxism. You see, usually Marxism and formalism are considered two contradictory movements, two contradictory impulses. And I am giving you an idea. Say, usually it is also said that if you are studying only the form, if you are studying syllables, sounds, structure, rhythm, all those things, and you are not taking up political questions which the work may imply, or some other questions the work may possibly have. Then probably you are running away from the real issues. This charge can be made. Okay, let us just look at it this way. Suppose there is a novel about exploitation of people at the hands of the political class. Suppose there is this novel, any novel, a novel which talks about the exploitation of people at the hands of the political class. This is a theme. And the novel uses very good language. Novel is divided into neat chapters. The novel also has very poetic kind of description of things. There are two critics. One is talking simply about the structure of sentences, the sounds which are used in a work, the patterns, the metaphors, the similes. Another critic is talking about the political class, that this political class has reduced these people to this kind of situation. This class is very cruel, this is very insensitive, and people must revolt against this class. Now, which of these interpretations is likely to land you into trouble at the hands of the political masters of the day? So, may I ask one of you, which interpretation? Okay, Arisha, I am unmuting you. Arisha, can you hear me?
Sir,
I'm sorry. Yes, Arisha.
yes, sir.
Which interpretation? Which of these two interpretations is likely to land you into trouble? If you simply talk about, say, structure, rhythm, syntax, sound, intonation, or you talk about this political question and hold the political class responsible for that exploitation.
So I'm understanding a little bit only. So
Okay, maybe I mute you and I ask Ehsan, yes.
The second one, sir, the political one.
Obviously. And so this is one important criticism of formalism, right? This is an important criticism of formalism. So usually formalism and Marxism, they were seen as two contradictory positions. Actually, there was one very interesting observation about formalism, and that observation was that too much focus on form and too much preoccupation with form will possibly not result in any revolution. Okay, so when Joss entered the scene, he found that Marxism and formalism, they were considered two contradictory positions. But he saw no dichotomy as such between the two positions. So one important thing that he did was, in his theory, he tried to bring the two positions together, right? So Marxism and formalism, they come together in his theory, in his reception theory. Now we have very little time, so if it just goes off, just bear with me, because after that we'll have say 10 minutes break. So Marxism and formalism, there is no dichotomy for Robert Joss. That was one important thing that he started with. And then he also believed that if literature is studied, it should be studied as a dialectical process of production and reception. That means both things are important. Production of literature, when something is produced, and its reception also. And this is true about many other things also. Say any text, its production and also its reception. Both things are important. So he talks about both these things. Now, if we see other things about his work, he offers a historical dimension, or he offers a historical dimension to reader-based criticism, right? As I said that he also made a very interesting analogy between a literary work and a timeless monument. He says that literary work does not show the same face to everyone in different periods. It is not like a monument which or Mount Everest, which was seen 200 years ago by somebody and which is seen by people today. So meaning is not fixed that way. Two words which are important. One is paradigm, and when he used the word paradigm, he brought the word paradigm from one scientist. That means in different periods there are different paradigms, different store, a certain storehouse of ideas, a certain kind of framework, a certain way of seeing things, a certain way how we look at things. So 19th century looked at things differently, and 17th century looked at those things very differently. When we are at a particular point of time, we do not have the sufficient distance to see those things from a different perspective. When we are part of a particular time period, possibly we do not have that distance with which to see that thing. There was also the term horizon of expectations. Now this is an interesting word, horizon. Joss talks about horizon of expectations of a certain kinds of readers. So if we are readers, we have certain horizons of expectations. If there was a writer like Shakespeare, Shakespeare also had a certain horizon of expectations. I'll explain this term horizon of expectations in the session after this break, because it can just go off any moment. So Joss, you know that there are 5 major influences on reception theory of Joss. We discussed those 5 influences, and then we also discussed the fact that there are some keywords which Joss uses. One is horizon of expectations and one is paradigm. And we also saw that Joss did not see any contradiction between Marxism and formalism. Usually Marxism and formalism, they are considered two very different kind of theoretical positions. What is horizon of expectations? And you can possibly note this, that we are talking about one very important German philosophical tradition, because reception theory is something which is specific to German literary tradition, German philosophical tradition. And here one particular university was the seat of this entire development. And which university? University of Constance. So we saw that how in reception theory there are factors which are important, some important influences, some important precursors, and we can place probably reception theory in proper perspective if we just identify those 5 very important influences. And I discussed those 5 influences in some kind of detail also in the last session. So to just touch those points again very briefly, we talked about Russian formalism. Russian formalism was a very important influence on reception theory, and especially in Russian formalism, this concept that art is a matter of using devices. In response to this question, what is literary and what is literariness? Then literary history was also something which was important in Russian formalism, because a whole say concept where one talks about the dominant, one talks about literary history, and one talks about development of certain genres where a particular genre becomes dominant and later that becomes unimportant as it becomes a routine thing. So literary history was also something which was a very important concern of Russian formalists. So these two important lessons from Russian formalism. One is the idea of talking about art as a matter of devices, and the second, literary history. That was an important concern in Russian formalism. And Russian formalism was an important influence on reception theory. Then we discussed the concepts of Roman Ingarden. He is less talked about German philosopher, Roman Ingarden, especially his concept of indeterminacy and his concept of gaps in text that is taken up by many reception theorists. Third important influence was Prague structuralism. And you know that structuralism was not confined to one area. Rather, you had a different kind of structuralism in Prague. And when structuralism took roots in France, then it had a very different kind of presence. And the fourth important thing was we have discussed his ideas at length, Gadamer, especially what he says about hermeneutics and what he says about the creative nature of prejudice, pre-understanding, and how prejudice and pre-understanding, they are aspects of a literary tradition, a dominant literary tradition. Again, this idea was discussed in the last session. And finally, a very important field, that field is sociology of literature, where one talks about, say, changing taste, where one talks about reception of works, and where one also talks about, say, a particular kind of historiography or all questions relating to historiography. So these five major influences on reception theory probably help understand reception theory in a very clear perspective. We discussed the concepts of Robert Joss, and I was discussing two concepts which are central to his work. One is the concept of paradigm, which comes from science, from the work of T. Kuhn, scientist, where one talks about a storehouse of ideas or a particular kind of framework which operates at a particular point of time, but later maybe in a different period that framework may be revised or it may be discarded, and another age comes out with its own framework, with its own paradigm. And here this concept of paradigm, which was used in the study of sciences, was applied to the study of literature. So we can see here some link between literary history and of course works of literature. The other important concept in Joss is the concept of horizon of expectations. Horizon of expectations. Now this is something which he has deliberately left a bit vague. What exactly is meant by horizon? But what is important here is that this concept horizon, this word horizon, has been used by a number of German philosophers, number of German writers. So this is not something new, but rather this is a term which has been used by, say, philosophers and literary theorists. So this word horizon becomes a loaded term. And again, it has a particular locale, and that locale is Germany, because we don't see this word being used in this sense outside Germany. It is only when translation of his work appeared in English that English readers became familiar with this word horizon in this particular sense. So what is meant by horizon of expectations? And you know that Robert Joss, does not find any contradiction between two positions which otherwise are considered contradictory. One is formalism and one is Marxism. Marxism, you know that gives emphasis to certain important concepts, like for example, what you say, economic factor or social forces, and formalism usually talks about a particular work of literature and the devices which are used in that work of literature, often not highlighting the historical context. But because in some versions of Russian formalism, the idea of literary history was also important. So Joss, in fact, draws upon that thread in formalism. So in nutshell, you can say that in his work, there is no contradiction as such between formalism and Marxism. These two otherwise contradictory impulses appear fairly, say, complementary to each other in his work. So what is meant by horizon of expectations? And here one can say that a particular kind of vision, the range of that vision or structure of experience of a hypothetical individual. That means an individual is seeing things from a particular vantage point. Now, when an individual sees things from a particular vantage point, that is his horizon, and that, in fact, he brings to a text also. So, if I am a reader, I have a particular horizon of expectations, and I have a particular range of vision, and I also have a particular structure of experience. So, when I look at a text, I bring that structure of experience, I bring that horizon, I bring that vision with me. So this means for Joss, reception of a work becomes important because we are talking about horizon of expectations, and here this horizon is the horizon of a reader, because reception theory is about reception of works. Just see those notes which I posted in this page, and you'll see that apart from the work of Joss, there are other important names also which we need to discuss. And what are those other names? There is one name which is mentioned here, and this is Wolfgang Isser. Right, Wolfgang Isser. And you know that Isser and the other person, I mean, most of these people were based in the University of Constance. So what is important about Isser? And here we must see Isser's work together with the work of Roman Ingarden. So what are the two terms which we encountered while reading Roman Ingarden? One is the term indeterminacy and the other is the term gap. And there is another term that is schemata. That means a work provides a kind of schemata. A work is a kind of skeleton structure. And then there is another term that we have come across. That term is, say, concretization and concretion. That means concretion of a structure, concretion of a loose structure, and concretion by the reader. That means any work for that matter does not come ready-made with meanings. Any work for that matter, and more so a literary work, has gaps and points of indeterminacies. Now those points of indeterminacies are filled up by a reader. Now see one example. The child bounced the ball. It's a simple sentence. The child bounced the ball. Maybe we come across this sentence somewhere. The child bounced the ball. Maybe some context will be provided and that will help, say, in the interpretation of this sentence. But for a while, if we just look at this sentence, the child bounced the ball, you try to think about the meaning of this sentence and you will be fairly justified in interpreting this sentence. Now let us look at this sentence again. how old is the child, whether he is 6, 8 or 10. That is one point of indeterminacy. What is the background of this child? Is he brown? Is he white? Is he black? Again, a point of indeterminacy. And if we see further, bounce the ball, again ball also. It can be a tennis ball, it can be a cricket ball, it can be a rubber ball, or it can be a, say, ball which is used in the game of soccer. So fine. Again, it is a point of indeterminacy, and you can say that maybe a text will provide some details later. That is also true. But there are many points of indeterminacy in any text. And so when the reader brings his structure of experience, he possibly fills up those gaps. Now, this is one point which is taken up in the work of Wolfgang Isser. So Isser also belongs to Constance School. He also comes from University of Constance. Now, what is important about Isser? The reader makes inferences. The reader fills up gaps. The reader has certain tacit knowledge of certain things. See, for example, he has read some text. He has a tacit understanding of the world. He has a particular view of the world. He has a particular view of literary conventions. Possibly things come to his help in the act of interpretation, in his act of interpretation. So what Isser is saying that all works have gaps, all works have points of indeterminacy. All works are concretized by the reader, concretized by the reader. That means it is the reader who possibly fills up all those gaps. Otherwise, a work is incomplete. It is a reader, for that matter, who concretizes a work. You see some link between his ideas and the ideas of Roman Ingarden, that as far as any text is concerned, it has gaps, it has points of indeterminacy, and reader brings his own tacit knowledge of the world with him. Reader brings his own idea of literary conventions with him. Reader brings his whole, say, notion of world and people with him, and with the help of those tacit, with the help of that tacit knowledge of the world, or his awareness of certain literary conventions, or his view of the world, he fills up the gaps and points of indeterminacy in a text, and that way he concretizes the work. What is important? And so the reader becomes a kind of co-author. The reader becomes a kind of co-author in any work. So here you see that perception theory, and especially the work of Isser, is giving reader a lot of freedom. That reader becomes a co-author. And why he becomes a co-author? Because he fills up those gaps, and he, in a way, is the co-author, because without that reader, that work possibly does not have any meaning as such. So this means, and here there is one term which is used in his work. That term is considered very authoritative also, that the reader normalizes all those indeterminacies. Normalizes. There is an amount of force behind this word. The reader normalizes those indeterminacies. Now we move from Germany to France to see a slightly different perspective. And here I want to introduce to you one very important name, and this is the name of Rene Barthes. What he has to say. You see that Rene Barthes has written a number of works, and it is very difficult to pigeonhole him. It is very difficult to label him. So he is a structuralist in a number of works, especially in his early phase, and Barthes is also a post-structuralist in his later works. And Barth becomes important because he also talks about reader. I'll talk, say, more about Barth in our discussion in post-structuralism. But at the moment, I'm just saying that Barth's perspective also becomes important here. And usually that is considered a difference in the worldview of a German thinker and a French thinker. And what is the difference when Barth talks about, say, pleasure of text? He pays attention to small details. He pays attention to the magic of words. And he, in a way, takes pleasure. He, in a way, luxuriates in that text. He, in a way, say, enjoys his whole experience of reading. On the other hand, if you see Isser, who provides a kind of co-authorship, now Isser's perspective is a bit different. You see these notes also, I have used just 2-3 words here. I'll just explain those words. One is a rationalist. You see, who is a rationalist? Isser. But one is a hedonist. Barth, in a way, because he's talking about the pleasure of the text, he's talking about the music of words, he's talking about a form of writing which in fact does not say anything, but rather where message itself is important, or his position is very close to, say, what Roman Jakobson says is the poetic function of language. That means no communication as such, but rather that message, that word, that sentence or that text becomes important for its own sake without communicating anything. So, hedonist. Isser is a rationalist, but Barth becomes a kind of hedonist. He is interested in the beauty of those words. And he is a bit asocial also there. So whereas Isser is using hermeneutics, Barth is identified with a kind of erotics which one can possibly draw from a work. Erotics and hermeneutics. See this major difference. And whereas, say, a very precise kind of method is important in the work of Isser, something is very akin to a kind of lab method. Barth appears to be sitting in a parlor, enjoying things. So this is the perspective of a French, and this is the perspective of a German critic. Now let us see another critic, another work rather, because we are also familiar with Jean-Paul Sartre. I know that Sartre, playwright, you are studying his play No Exit, and Sartre is also an essentialist. But Sartre has also written a book about the nature of literature. What is literature? And there he is talking about the production of a work. He's talking about and what is important about Sartre is that he also says that any work, for that matter, and more so a literary work, has a reader which is implied by that text. That means reader, a particular kind of reader is part of the very structure of a text. That means you cannot separate a particular kind of reader from the text, and the text envisages that reader. Here I am giving you one example. There is this sentence: Jack staggered red nose out of the pub. This is a sentence which is used by Terry Eagleton. We can possibly use other sentences. He appeared, and on the spur of the moment, I'm just thinking about a sentence. Say, Jack staggered red nose out of the pub. If you see this sentence, the reader is supposed to have a fair idea of English, structure of English, but he also is supposed to have a fair idea about the world also, about his world also. Now, many Muslim readers may not understand the implication of this word at all, right? So, for example, there is pub. Pub is the place where people have wine, and when people have wine, probably their body also undergoes some kind of change for a while. They become maybe red also, their complexion becomes red at that moment. So this relationship between wine, pub, and becoming red, this is kind of cultural knowledge. But since a writer is using that sentence, so the reader is implied by that structure. Now this is not understood by everyone maybe. And similarly, when you are writing something or somebody is writing from his or her own perspective in India, it becomes something very different. The other day there is an interesting message here. The other day I conducted a kind of experiment on some people. There is a beautiful song in old Amitabh Bachchan, Rajesh Khanna film, Namak Haram. The old film, old classic by Rishikesh Mukherjee. There is a line in that song, and the line is मेरे घर से कुछ सामान मिलेगा, दीवाने शायर का एक दीवान मिलेगा. मेरे घर से कुछ सामान मिलेगा, दीवाने शायर का एक दीवान मिलेगा. I asked this to my domestic help. What exactly is the meaning of this word here? मेरे घर से कुछ सामान मिलेगा, दीवाने शायर का एक दीवान मिलेगा. He said, Diwan, this bed? I asked my son, who is a fairly advanced reader of text, what is the meaning of this? He also said the same thing, that Diwan milega, kuch saman milega, and after the saman, Diwane Shair ka ek Diwan milega. So Diwan, in that sense, actually, for him also it was bed. An interesting thing is that in that video, there is a poet who is facing death and who is lying on a bed. So there was some, say, clue also maybe, or a kind of misleading clue also, that there is this bed and maybe somebody who picks up his saman, he'll get this bed. But of course, readers who are familiar with the certain literary conventions in India, say Shair and Diwan is a collection of poems. So probably it is not very difficult for them to understand. But here, if we see this sentence, then it was not easy for everyone. So probably this sentence or this poem or this use of words, it had a reader also, which was part of the structure of this sentence. So Sartre is also talking about his readers, but his idea of reader is very different. He's talking about the production of a text, and he's talking about a reader which is very much implied by the text. Finally, we can have a look at another important name, Stanley Fish. And Stanley Fish again is German. And you know that there was a very big debate, very important debate between Stanley Fish and Wolfgang Isser. Stanley Fish actually does not consider that there is any text. So maybe we have a book, but he does not consider. And there is a beautiful essay, which is, its title is also very interesting. It is not simply rhetorical. Is there a text in this class? Is there a text in this class? So here his idea is that there is no text as such, unless you have a reader who produces that text. Isser grants co-authorship to a reader, but Fish does not even grant that kind of co-authorship to a reader. So what is important about, say, Fish, that when you think about a reader, it is the reader who actually writes the text. Now let us see it this way. If you think about this sentence, what does this sentence, and you complete this sentence, you'll say that what does this sentence mean? But Fish turns this sentence on its head and he says, what does this sentence do? And he is talking about all possible strategies. And he's talking about all those revisions which go on in the mind of a reader as they read. So that means reader are indulging in a lot of activity when they are reading. And it is only through that activity that a text is produced. But Fish grants some kind of concession to readers. When he talks about his idea of certain communities of readers. And so, for example, if I am a reader, if you are a reader, we come from a particular background, we have a particular background of reading, and we possibly share our ideas about certain literary conventions, and so we form a kind of community. And so, for example, university professors and students, they form a community. And on the other hand, ordinary people on the street who don't have any, say, background in literary study, but they also form a kind of community. And then this community can also be formed along different lines. So that is Fish's idea. Now, in this entire discussion, and of course, we don't have too much time here for this session to end. In this entire discussion of phenomenology, hermeneutics, reception theory, different kinds of readers, we saw that there was one effort on the part of critics. And what was that effort? They want to hammer a nail. And there are different nails for a literary work. That means you put a nail and get a kind of interpretation. That means different critical positions provide different kinds of nails. So for example, hermeneutics provides one nail with which to fix the meaning of a text. And there are other nails also. We can see that there are different theories which talk about different methods of arriving at the meaning of a work. So phenomenology provides one important method. Hermeneutics and phenomenology and reader response criticism and reception theory, possibly they are related positions, but I brought out the difference also between different positions. So what we have done in all these lectures in the classroom and lectures, say, which are almost like classroom lectures, because I see you and probably you are less distracted here in this class. So what we see that we have covered a lot of ground. I have suggested some books also. I have also posted some material also, and I posted one write-up by Isser, that is phenomenological reading, and there is one short essay by, say, George Paulet. Again, he belongs to one particular school. So you'll find those two essays interesting, especially read first 5-6 pages of Isser's essay and the complete essay, which is hardly of 7 pages by George. And for reference, if I have to talk about one book, then Terry Eagleton has a very beautiful chapter on this entire subject in his book. There are other things also. There is also, I mentioned reception theory, that book in New Excel by, I have mentioned that name also in those references. After this, we'll talk about structuralism. But before that, I must give you a chance to talk about a few things. And I said that you can always post your questions on this WhatsApp group. I'll try to answer those questions in the session. But unless you read these things on your own, you'll probably not follow the connections. And it has been my effort to also establish connections. Say, for example, what is the connection between, say, Russian formalism and, say, the other theories? And here, just to share one insight, you are probably studying many things, you are studying about many theoretical positions in this class. They appear isolated, they are not. There is always a link between one position. There is always a link between different positions. It is not simply a matter of influence, but also something as simple as that you cannot understand one position probably without understanding other positions. And here to just say, share an anecdote with you. These days, we hear about economists talking about virus and other people talking about virus. So just share one anecdote with you. Probably you must have heard the name of Madhu Dandavate. He was the finance minister in VP Singh's government. VP Singh was Prime Minister of India in year 1989. Madhu Dandavate was a professor of physics in Bombay University and professor of nuclear physics. And he would say that you cannot understand economics unless you understand nuclear physics. And something more, he used to ask very probing questions. When VP Singh made him his finance minister, and actually it appeared a kind of choice which came from nowhere because he was teaching at Bombay University. Later he asked VP Singh that I don't even come from your party and nobody was even thinking about me. So how could you just say think about me? He said that when I was prime minister, when I was finance minister, you know that before becoming prime minister, VP Singh was also a finance minister. He said that when I was finance minister and I used to present my budget, you used to ask very probing questions, sometimes questions which I could not handle easily. So at that time, I thought that if ever I become prime minister, I'll make you my finance minister. Good thing is that VP Singh say remembered that resolve and he made him finance minister. But what is important there is that you cannot understand economics unless you understand nuclear physics. That means there is always relation to developments. So we are not talking about isolated positions. We are talking about this entire world of philosophy and theory, where one position is related to another position. So try to read theory from this perspective also, that what is the link of this theory to another theory. So I'm going to unmute you for a while. So let there be some chaos. Yes, then sit back, relax. Listen to you. I said that there is some chaos, but from chaos comes clarity.
All of you.
Okay, Madhya, would you like to say something?
Sir, I'll read about it and then I'll ask the question.
Right. Yes, Arun Bashir. You see, I'll continue teaching you using the framework, and next I'll discuss. So let us hear from one of you. Okay. I can unmute others and I can mute is everyone except Islam. Yes, Isan.
Yes, sir. So,
Just
sir,
sum up
I would like to ask that. Yeah.
Just sum up everything.
So, I don't agree with this Stanley Fish because he says that there is no text. So, what is the part of the writer, the author who has struggled a lot to produce a text?
Absolutely.
And we are directly rejecting the contribution of the author and putting whole credit to the reader.
Absolutely.
So, how can this?
In fact, I also agree with you, because if we just move this discussion outside the class, then we say that this is a very extreme kind of position. And
Yes, sir.
that, is there in text in this class? Okay, we can say that there are probably as many interpretations of a work as possible, but still the agency of the writer cannot be denied, and that is one reason why the agency of writer is still relevant. If you see many of those bookstores where a work is mentioned, and the work is mentioned as having been written by a writer, and then we also see that publishers also spend a lot of money on projecting the image of a writer, where that writer becomes important, right?
Yes.
But you see that this is just one position. There was another position where one talked about, say, an interpretation
Yes,
of
sir.
work based on the consciousness of a writer, how a reader enters the consciousness of a writer by reading all his works, right? So that is a fair point. That is a fair point of criticism. So would you like to add something?
SR's point is good.
Yeah.
He gives contribution.
So in terms of clarity, did you follow the discussion?
SR's point is good.
Yeah. Okay, right.
So